Hey guys, so now I'd like to show you some things about square roots. First of all, I'm going to start with the definition down here. The square root of a number is one of the two equal factors of the number. 4 is a square root of 16 because 4 times 4 is 16. The symbol for a square root looks like this, which is also known as a radical sign. So what do we mean when we talk about a perfect square? A perfect square is the square of a whole number. It's the number you get when you multiply that number by itself. The number 49 is a perfect square because 49 equals 7 times 7, or 7 squared. And 7 is a whole number. The perfect square has to be a product of two whole numbers. So, for example, 6.25 is not a perfect square, even though when you do 2.5 times 2.5, you do get 6.25. However, 2.5 is not a whole number. So 6.25 is not a perfect square. So a perfect square is what you get when you multiply a number by itself, and the square root is what you get when you try to figure out the root of a perfect square. So why do we call it a square root? Why not a rectangle root or a triangle root? Well, it just comes from the fact that the area of a square is the length of that side times itself. Here you see the area of the square, which is 9, which is 3 times 3, or 3 squared. Okay, square root. That's where it comes from. That's where the word square root comes from. So what do we actually need to be able to do? Well, we need to be able to find the square root of a number. So when you see a radical sign like this with a number inside of it, you're trying to figure out what number times itself would give you that number inside the radical sign. In other words, what is the square root of 25? That's how you read that. What is the square root of 25? In other words, so what number times itself would give us 25? And that's pretty easy, that answer is 5. 5 times 5 is 25. So the square root of 25 is 5. I'm going to show you some other ways we can look at 25 inside a radical sign and show you the difference. In this example, we have the square root of 25 with a negative sign outside of it. Well, we would simply follow the order of operation, and square roots actually fall under the grouping symbol category. Under the please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. It falls under the exponent. So whatever, you always do parentheses first, then you would do exponents and square roots. We haven't seen them yet, but they do fall in that order of operation, okay? They're second most important after parentheses. So that means in this problem, we're going to evaluate the square root of 25, which is 5, and then it's like there's an invisible -1 being multiplied by this square root. So that means the answer is going to be -5. The negative square root of 25 is -5. In this example, you've got this little symbol. This is a plus or a minus sign here. We read this as plus or minus the square root of 25. So that just wants you to notice that technically the square root of 25 could be 5 or -5, couldn't it? Because if you think about it, 5 times 5 is 25, but -5 times -5 is also 25. So this symbol means that the square root of 25 really could be positive or -5. So when you see the little plus or minus outside the radical sign, it's just reminding you that the square root really could be a positive or a negative number, because a negative times a negative does give you a positive. So this plus or minus square root of 25, you can write it as plus or minus, or positive or -5. Technically, theoretically, this solution is also plus or minus 5. You don't always have to write it that way, but whenever you see that little symbol, go ahead and make sure you write it as plus or minus. Which brings us to one last example down here. The square root of negative 25. Now I want you to think for a moment. Is there any way to have a number and multiply it by itself to get a negative? Think about it. The only way to get a negative product is when you multiply a positive by a negative. So those roots are going to be two different numbers. There is no way to get a negative, the square root of a negative number. There's no way to multiply a number by itself, the exact same number, and get a negative. It's impossible. So this is no solution. There's no way you can get the square root of negative 25. You can say 5, you can say negative 5, but technically 5 times 5 is 25, not negative 25. Negative 5 times negative 5 is also 25, not negative. So, if you have a negative inside the radical sign, then there's no solution. There is no square root. There's no way you can find the square root of a negative number. And the difference between this and this is the negative sign here is inside the square root. Here the negative sign is outside the radical or square root sign. So this is negative 5 because you find the square root of 25 first, which is 5. Then you multiply by negative. So that gives us an answer of negative 5, whereas this is asking us to do something that's impossible. You cannot find a number and multiply by itself to get a positive number, to get a negative square root, sorry. So take a look at this other example, and it's the same concept I just demonstrated. What if you have a negative sign outside the square root? This is just like the last problem we did. If you have a negative outside the square root, first find the square root of the number inside the radical. The square root of 64 is 8. And then since the negative is outside the radical sign, we just add it to our answer. Because it's like multiplying, finding the square root of 64, which is 8, and it's like multiplying it by negative 1 after we find the square root. So that's how we get negative 8. However, this one, remember, if the negative is inside the radical sign, it's not negative 8. You cannot multiply two equal numbers, two numbers that are the same, and get a negative. So this would be no solution, no answer. Cannot find that square root. So I'd like you to try these problems. Go ahead and try these, what we have here. 10 problems. Pause the video, unpause when you're finished, and we'll check your answers. All right, let's take a look at what you got. Here we have the square root of 16 with a negative on the outside, so that would give us negative 4. Square root of 1, what times what will give you 1? That's just 1. Plus or minus the square root of 81, well, the square root of 81 is 9, and technically it could be positive or negative 9. Square root of 4 is 2. Square root of 9 is 3. Square root of negative 36 cannot be done. There is no number that you can multiply by itself to get a negative, so this would be no solution or no answer, however you want to explain that. Square root of 25 is 5. Checking your answers so far. The plus or minus square root of 64, well, the square root of 64 is 8, and technically it could be positive or negative 8. The square root of 100, did you figure that one out? What times what is 100? And that answer is 10. Oh, we missed one down here. The negative square root of 49, well, the square root of 49 is 7, and since it's a negative outside the radical sign, we multiply by negative 1, and that would give us negative 7. How'd you do? We'll practice more with square roots, and we'll also practice solving some real-life problems where we see square roots tomorrow. See you then.